This program was made possible by funding from the University of Central Florida's Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies.
The islands themselves are under threat by development simply because they're so high and dry. And sand is good to burrow in, but it's also excellent to build on.
Well, there's only one Lake Wales Ridge, and if we totally lose it, we will have lost some of the biodiversity of the earth.
Hello, I'm Linda Chapin with the University of Central Florida. Welcome to Naturally Central Florida, a series of programs about 7 unique and beautiful places in our Florida landscape. A group of business people, citizens, and environmentalists have come together in an effort to save these special places. And we'd like to get you and your family involved as well. Today we're going to tell you about the Lake Wales Ridge, which some people have referred to as Florida's ancient islands. That's because this spine down the center of our peninsula was the seashore of 1 million years ago. It's hard to believe that this land along Highway 27, with its orange juice stands and gas stations, could be designated as a totally unique environment. But between thousands of varieties of beetles, the sociable but endangered scrub jay, and a weird plant called the hairy wireweed, this place is pretty special. Naturally Central Florida's Alicia Callanan Mandigo takes us there and tells us why.
A little scarab beetle. See it?
It doesn't look alive.
Oh, it's alive. It's just playing dead.
Oh.
When you're talking environment in Florida, this is the high point, literally. The Lake Wales Ridge is the highest point in all of Florida, a dizzying 300 feet above sea level. There was a time when it was the only spot in Florida above sea level, which is exactly why it's so unique today.
We're here on what is called the Lake Wales Ridge, which is really an enormous kind of spit of sand that sticks down along the spine of Florida, left here by ancient oceans.
So can you tell us a little bit about how that worked?
Well, there's a series of rises and falls in the ocean, and when that happened, sand was pushed up very much like, say, Cape Cod today, only of course, it was much farther south. And the sand that was pushed up was silica sand. So this sand that you see here is pure, almost pure silica, and nothing much happens to it. It doesn't decompose. It doesn't turn into rock like the coral sands. It just stays here. So this has been a very, very stable place for a very, very long time.
And when we talk about islands and speciation, you can kind of think, okay, Australia has animals and plants that we don't find anywhere else because they were all isolated. But the same thing happened here. Is that right?
Well, that's true of all the great ridges of Florida. They've all been isolated as islands, either actual islands in the sea or habitat islands, desert-like dry conditions surrounded by much wetter areas. So they've had evolution of their own species, very much as in the Galapagos, for example.
Okay, so tell us about what's here.
So here we have a whole series of plants and animals that are specialized for life here. Unfortunately, many of them are very small, so you can't see them particularly easily. And some of them are very undramatic as well. So this plant here, for example, this is called the papery whitlowwort.
Okay.
And it's a species, it's sometimes called a sand square because it often occurs in a sort of square outline. And it's a species that occurs here on the Lake Wales Ridge, coming up in very sterile, bare, dry, open sand where not many things want to live.
Okay, so for instance, this is not something I would find in Orlando.
You wouldn't find this particular species, but Orlando also is on a ridge, the Orlando Ridge. And the Orlando Ridge has some very interesting and unusual things as well. But this ridge is bigger and this ridge is older, so it has more things than the Orlando Ridge does.
So you're thinking, cool, it's a really old pile of sand. You're thinking that because you really have to get down low to see all that's going on here. There's an entire forest growing here. It's just a really teeny tiny forest. It's also an incredibly potent recharge area that absorbs up to 50 inches of rain a year. And it's bug world, big time. There are so many different kinds of bugs living out here that biologists have struggled just to count them, let alone study them.
I sit here year after year listing things, and I now know that there are more than 1,000 species of butterflies and moths that live on the station. There are more than 1,000 species of beetles that live here, and more than 1,000 species in the group that includes the ants, bees, and wasps. So we have 115 species of ants alone, for example, and over 100 species of native solitary bees. So these habitats are enormously diverse. And just as this plant, which lives in this scrub, has all sorts of interesting things to tell us.
What the creepy array of beetles and all these funky little plants had to tell us is how to survive.
That entire diversity is based on adaptations that we don't even know about yet. So, for example, you can imagine in a soil like this, ants can burrow through it very easily. Ants eat all sorts of things. And here, there are hundreds of species of insects that make burrows in the sand and then store prey like caterpillars or grasshoppers. And the ants don't eat those prey, but if you took those grasshoppers and caterpillars and offered them an ant, the ant would come and eat it. They'd carry them back to their nest. So all those insects have some anti-ant defense. And since no one is there to protect these prey, it has to be a chemical. So all these species have various kinds of ant-repellent chemicals that we have no idea of. So this gives you an idea of how when you look at an area which is especially difficult to live in, the adaptations of the organisms there may be particularly valuable to us in ways that we haven't had time to look at. And since there's 1,000 species of beetles here, obviously nobody has looked at what 1,000 species of beetles do to protect themselves.
It's definitely a bug's world out here, but the Lake Wales Ridge is hardly an exclusive bug resort.
Oh yeah, that's bear.
Is that bear?
Yeah, look at that. Very nice. You can see acorns in it.
Black bears and bobcat roam the ridge, as do gopher tortoises. It's also one of the few places left where you're likely to see an endangered scrub jay.
Well, the scrub jay is one of the animals that's in a considerable amount of trouble, even though it is recognized as being an important bird for federal protection. And the reason is that it has certain demands that are hard to meet. And one is that it needs quite a large area per family. So this is not an easy habitat to make a living in. Each scrub jay family, and they live in families, has to have about 20 acres. The problem is that you have to have more than one family because brothers and sisters will not mate in this species. They'll only mate with unrelated individuals. So you have to have a whole series of families all living in close proximity. They don't move very far. So that they have a requirement that the scrub be of a certain type. That is, it has to be burned every about 15 to 30 years, sometimes more frequently, depending on how fast it grows. So this scrub needs, the scrub jay needs acreage. The scrub jay needs acreage, and not only acreage, but prime acreage. And that acreage now is very expensive. So it's only really completely protected, in spite of its status, in a few places where there's enough territory for it.
The prime acreage the scrub jay needs is the same prime acreage developers need to build homes. The ridges had once been islands when Florida was covered by water. They're now islands in a sea of development.
The islands themselves are under threat by development simply because they're so high and dry. And sand is good to burrow in, but it's also excellent to build on. And nobody has to worry. If you put your house right here, you'd never have to worry about it being flooded. Not until like the entire rest of Florida was flooded. So for that reason, it's a very desirable place to live. And all around this area, scrub areas and other natural habitats are being gobbled up by developments, just as in every other place. So on the Lake Wales Ridge, about 80-some% of it is now no longer in natural habitat. So there's only little islands within the island.
So what's being done to help preserve what's left of the ridge?
Well, there's a series of preserves that have been set up. And when I first came here 23 years ago, there was only archbold in one other place. And now there's a whole series of preserves. So species that I was sure would go extinct during the time I was spending at the station actually are now in much better shape than they were. And certainly there's a lot of interest in scrub habitats in these uplands around the state. And several places or several other areas are now on the list of places that we hope will be purchased.
Name a species, for instance, you were concerned might go extinct but is now in better shape.
Well, this one in front of you is a really good example. This
Okay.
is a very unexciting looking plant, but
Looks like
nonetheless,
milkweed or something.
yeah, it's called the hairy wireweed. And the hairy wireweed is a plant that lives here on the Lake Wales Ridge. And it is, at the time when I first arrived here, it was protected in 2 places. But if you looked up and down this roadway here, you'd see hundreds and hundreds of plants. And now that it's in it's in more than 10 preserves. So now that it's in more than 10 preserves with hundreds of thousands of plants, it's possible that it's no longer really an endangered species.
And exactly what role does the hairy wireweed play in the world? Well, we don't really know. Scientists haven't yet had time to study it, which is the ultimate argument for preserving the Lake Wales Ridge. There are tens of thousands of species out here that we don't know anything about, and this is the only place in the world you can find them.
It's because it's a whole system that doesn't occur in other places. And even though these plants, for example, look very insignificant, if you look at what they're living in, you realize that they have some tricks that we would like to know about.
There were Native Americans on the Lake Wales Ridge 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. But to the settlers of the early 1900s, the sandy soils looked like a desert landscape, until they realized the land was perfect for growing citrus. For a long time, the smell of orange blossoms was the major springtime experience along Highway 27. But now, home builders see the high and dry Lake Wales Ridge as perfect for their needs. We'll tell you more about some places along the ridge that are being protected from being turned into subdivisions when we come back. Since we described the Lake Wales Ridge as an ancient sand dune, you might think that the ridge's sand hills have a sort of perpetual quality to them, but it's not true at all. 100 years ago, the sand hills were covered by longleaf pine trees, but years of logging and farming and fire suppression have changed the sand hills so much that these days sandhill vegetation is even rarer than scrub. And because of that, over 30 plant and animal species dependent on the sandhills are now threatened with extinction. The Lake Wales Ridge is recognized as having the most endemic species of any spot in North America. which might seem to give it obvious environmental value. But Florida has lots of newcomers, and the value of the ridge isn't quite so obvious to them. In fact, you could easily make the argument that you really need to have grown up in the area to be able to appreciate the ridge, which may be why a lot of ridge natives have made it their mission to try and protect it. Alicia met with one such resident who has made protecting the ridge his life's work.
You know, this open structure, we call it, is what is conducive for rare plants, because these rare plants live in these gaps,
Right.
sand gaps, these openings.
The spot Steve Morrison knows as the Lake Wales Ridge looks quite a bit different from the scrub and sand that defines most of the ridge. It's a spot his father introduced him to as a kid.
When I was a boy, my dad brought me out here to Tiger Creek, and we eventually ended up buying this place. And after I got out of college, I wanted to live, decided I wanted to live a simple lifestyle, and this was a perfect place to settle in. And I just decided, I made a conscious decision to dedicate my life to working for, not just to make money, but to do something positive. And conservation was a natural because my dad was a conservationist. So.
It's a place so dynamic and diverse that even though he's been exploring the ridge since childhood, he's still discovering things.
I think the natural environment here is just always changing. And you know, I lived my whole life in a period of drought when the water tables have been going down for the last 40 years. And now all of a sudden, in the last year and a half, we're in a flood event here at Tiger Creek. And everything is different. Things that used to be high and dry are now all of a sudden in the wetlands. We never realized they were wetlands. And there's new species that are there in those wetlands, and they're feeding on things that weren't there. And it's just, there's change everywhere. And so it's really a dynamic place, and nature is, and working with that is always adapting to change.
Today, Morrison serves as a Lake Wales Ridge Preserve Manager with the Nature Conservancy.
Well, this has been just an incredible experience that I fell into when I moved here. I was just minding my own business. I was a beekeeper at that time and just kind of struggling to stay alive and live close to the land. And I fell into this beautiful habitat and found out how special it was. And then I got the opportunity to start working here to help protect it. And my life has just been a continual education into this incredible natural world that's really right here all around all of us.
Morrison not only protects the ridge, he's lived on it for over 30 years.
Well, we're on the eastern edge of the Lake Wales Ridge here. And the Lake Wales Ridge was sticking up out of the ocean when every other part of Florida was underwater. And from here all the way to Vero Beach, it's basically flat. And this is the last terrace that drops off to that flat, which was a flat, shallow sea for thousands and thousands of years. And really, in geological time, only recently popped out to be the Florida that we know now. But at one time, the Lake Wales Ridge was all that there was of Florida.
So because it kind of had this sort of isolated existence for a period in history, what is the result of this area been? Because it is different from other parts of Florida.
Right, well, because the rest of Florida was inundated at times and came up and went back underwater, it is different significantly than this part of Florida, the Lake Wales Ridge, because it has been here continuously for over 2 million years. And so there's a lot of things here that are here because of that long time to evolve and get adapted to this particular environment. And so the Lake Wales Ridge has lots of things that none of the rest of Florida has.
These squiggly lines in the sand, for instance, you won't find them anywhere else in Florida because the little lizard that burrows underground to make them only lives on the Lake Wales Ridge.
The reptiles that we have here on the ridge that are found nowhere else in the world are very small. The sand skink is 4 inches long and it lives in the sand. So the casual person that just walks into the scrub and looks around won't see a sand skink, but it's there in the sand, and it's been there for millions of years. It's the last member of its family that has made it into this geological period, and it is the only sand skink that there is. All the rest went extinct a long time ago, and this is the only place that they know and the only place that they have left.
Morrison says the state has done a good job of establishing preserves, but the job doesn't stop with simply setting land aside.
I think we have to manage what we have, and that's what my job is to manage Tiger Creek Preserve and several other preserves here on the ridge. And we have to manage these lands now because they are isolated, and we are really managing the effects that people have on these protected lands. For example, fire can't burn from lightning the way it used to because it is so hazardous to the people that live around our protected areas. So we have to put fire carefully back into the woods, and we have to manage exotic invasive species that have been brought from other places in the world and are threatening to take over our habitats. And so there's many aspects to managing what we have chosen to protect, and that's really important. If we don't focus on that, once we protect them, then we won't keep it looking the way it's looked forever.
Morrison says he likes daydreaming about what the ridge looked like millions of years ago, but he thinks his little enclave near Tiger Creek gives him a pretty good picture.
Well, I would love to know that, and I spend probably too much time thinking about what it used to look like, and I think it did look very similar to what you see now. This area is remarkably similar to how it was when I first moved here. It's everything else in Florida that I've seen the dramatic change in, but you know, we've done a really remarkable job in Florida to protect these wild lands, and here especially on the Lake Wales Ridge, where we've protected I think 35 preserves now to save the last pieces of this Lake Wales Ridge ecosystem. So we're going to keep those places forever and ever wild. Well, there's only one Lake Wales Ridge, and if we totally lose it, we will have lost some of the biodiversity of the earth. And every landscape has its specialness, and really the Lake Wales Ridge is one of the most special places in Florida, and it's really important to protect that.
There are lots of places you can go to experience the Lake Wales Ridge. Steve Morrison just told you about one of them, the Nature Conservancy's Tiger Creek Preserve, 5,000 acres, open to the public. One of my favorite places in Florida is the beautiful historic Box Sanctuary, which preserves many endangered plants from the ridge. And these lush garden landscapes were designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. He was the creator of New York's Central Park. And you can find other places to go or learn more about the Lake Wales Ridge by going to Naturally Central Florida at these websites. I hope you'll join me for the next edition of Naturally Central Florida, when we'll take you to another of the 7 must-save places in Central Florida. Until then, thanks for watching.